is a moment when the day appears completely ordinary. Nothing dramatic has happened. The room is quiet, the air feels familiar, and life continues beyond the window. Yet somewhere beneath that calm, a small discomfort begins to grow. The character notices other people moving through life with confidence, purpose, and direction. Without intending to, they begin measuring themselves against those distant images. The contrast feels gentle at first. Outer calm remains unchanged, but inside questions gather quietly. Why does everyone seem ahead? Why does their own path feel slower, smaller, harder to understand lately than it ever seemed before? As the feeling settled, the habit became clearer. The character moved through ordinary days, yet their attention kept drifting toward other lives. A promotion appeared, a celebration appeared, a smile captured in a photograph appeared. Each small glimpse seemed to whisper the same message: everyone else was moving forward. Meanwhile, nothing looked wrong from the outside. Conversations continued, responsibilities were met, and the world remained unchanged. Inside, however, a different story was forming. Achievements felt smaller, delays felt larger, and quietly, without warning, self-worth began to shrink. The comparison was never announced aloud, yet it followed them everywhere they went. The thought did not arrive suddenly. It had been growing for years, collecting pieces from different seasons of life. Long ago, certain ages seemed tied to certain milestones. Success had a schedule, happiness had a timetable, and the future looked simple from a distance. Now, standing in the present, the character could feel the gap between expectation and reality. Dreams once imagined as inevitable remained unfinished. Plans had changed, circumstances had shifted, and time had moved differently than expected. In the quiet contrast between what was promised and what existed, disappointment found room to stay a little while longer there. The story did not answer those questions immediately. Instead, it began to notice something that comparison often hides. Every person who seemed successful carried a history that could not be seen from the outside. Behind achievements were disappointments. Behind confidence were doubts. Behind steady progress were moments of uncertainty, fear, and waiting. The character had been comparing private struggles to public images. That realization did not erase the pain, but it softened its edges. Appearances were not the whole story, neither were assumptions. Quietly, a different possibility emerged. Perhaps everyone was carrying something unseen, hidden beneath smiles, plans, achievements too. With that thought lingering gently in the background, the character began looking at certain years differently. These were the years they usually avoided revisiting, years that seemed empty when compared to the lives of others. Nothing remarkable appeared to have happened. Progress felt slow. Dreams were postponed. Some days were spent simply enduring what could not be changed. For a long time, those seasons looked like proof of failure. Yet from a quieter distance, another truth became visible. Surviving difficult periods required strength, even when that strength went unnoticed. Endurance had been present where achievement seemed absent.
The contrast was striking. What once looked like wasted time now carried traces of courage, patience, and persistence. As that understanding slowly settled, another realization emerged. The comparison had never been as harmless as it seemed. For years, attention had been directed outward, toward other people's timelines, achievements, and visible progress. In doing so, something important had been overlooked. Personal growth had become difficult to recognize because it was always standing beside someone else's success. Every step forward felt too small. Every accomplishment seemed incomplete. The contrast between reality and perception widened until they barely resembled each other. While life had continued moving, appreciation for that movement had quietly disappeared. The exhaustion was not only from struggling through difficult years, it also came from constantly believing that wherever they stood was never enough. For the first time in a long while, the character stopped looking outward and turned their attention inward. What they found was not the failure they had imagined for years. Instead, they found a person who had carried disappointments, adapted to changes, and continued moving despite uncertainty. The harsh voice of judgment grew quieter as understanding slowly took its place. There was a contrast between the person they believed they were and the person who had actually lived through those years. One existed in criticism, the other in reality. Looking closely, they could see effort where they once saw weakness. The disappointment remained, but it no longer defined everything. It became only one part of a much larger story. From that gentler perspective, the shape of life began to look different. The character noticed how often they had treated life like a race, measuring distance instead of experience. Yet every path was influenced by circumstances that could not be compared fairly. Some people moved quickly because their roads were smooth. Others traveled slowly while carrying invisible weight. The contrast between competition and personal experience became impossible to ignore. Progress was no longer a straight line stretching towards a finish. It was a collection of moments, choices, setbacks, and recoveries woven together over time. As this understanding settled, self-blame loosened its grip. The journey remained imperfect, but it finally felt like it belonged to them alone. Nothing around the character changed overnight. The world continued moving at its usual pace. Other people still celebrated achievements, reached milestones, and shared moments that looked bright from a distance. Yet something inside had become quieter. The need to constantly measure their life against others no longer felt as powerful as before. The contrast remained, but it no longer carried the same weight. They understood now that every life contains struggles hidden beneath the surface, including their own. Looking back, they could see growth where they once saw only absence. The questions were not completely gone, but they felt softer. In that quiet understanding, a small sense of peace finally found room to stay.